Hello, today we're on our second class about the Hellenistic period, right? It's our seventh class, and today we're going to talk about Epicureanist ethics, the last part of Epicurus. So I highly recommend you watch the sixth class because we talked about Epicureanist logic and physics, right? And then we're going to talk about Stoicism, beginning with an overview about Stoicism, and then we're going to talk about early Stoic logic and physics. The physics are quite big and quite different. So we're going to get some time on it. And on our next class, we're going to talk about the early Stoic ethics, which are the most important part of Stoic philosophy, right? Just as any other Hellenistic philosopher, they frequently are have this tendency to talk about ethics, right? Then talking about Epicureanist ethics. This first part we're going to talk about the more theoretical ethic, the the part of Epicureanist ethics that are related. There are a lot related to metaphysics, that are related to its physics, right? And then the second part, we're going to talk about more practical uh, tips that Epicurus suggests, right? Then talking about the first part, we have since our senses are correct, and everything is matter. So do good. So the good, the right, is a substance on Epicurus, right? It is a thing, the good, and it is made of matter. And you can see this good on things, and these things that have good, with capital G, are good things. Therefore, pleasurable, if something is pleasurable, this something is good, right? So pleasure is the sensitive expression of good, just as paper have the sensitive expression of a rectangular white thing. Good has this sensitive expression of pleasure. And that's a little that's easy to get. Okay, it makes sense. But the lack of suffering is one of the biggest pleasures. So here Epicurus changed the places and gets out of classical of stereotyped hedonism, right? He does not want lots of pleasure and intense pleasures. He says that the biggest pleasure is the lack of suffering. So that's what he aims for, the lack of suffering. Therefore, the reason should guide us to precisely avoid perturbation while seeking for pleasure. So we need to use our reason, we don't need to ignore it, although the good things are not rational, it is an emotion, it is pleasure. We're not supposed to act like beasts seeking for pleasure. We need to rationally calculate and have just the maximum amount of pleasure, and considering that the lack of suffering is a very, very big pleasure. So we have the types of pleasure: natural and necessary, unnecessary but natural, and unnatural. Natural and necessary are to eat when you're hungry, drink water when you're thirsty, so and to rest when you're tired. Those are natural and necessary. We they are highly pleasuring, like it's very good to drink a cup of water when you're thirsty, and they're very easy to get. So in general, it's not that hard to rest when you're tired, and it's very accessible, right? The unnecessary but natural is to eat good food, to drink good drinks. They normally need some effort. They normally need you to suffer a little bit. As an example, for you to have a comfortable house, that's unnecessary but natural. You need to work, and working is suffering, right? So you are having a perturbation for that. So Normally, we do not want the unnecessary and natural pleasures, but maybe some of them are good, you know? Sex is also unnecessary and natural. And then we have the unnatural pleasures to get rich, to get prestigious, status, and all these kind of stuff that are social, you know? Now we can remember a little bit of the of cynicism, right? This anti-cultural philosophical theory. Epicurus have this a lot too. He says that the unnatural pleasures are completely avoidable, and you want to avoid them in the maximum as you can, because they bring you a lot of perturbation, and they bring you very few pleasure, you know. So in general, the unnatural pleasures do not worth, and there is no such a thing as my death, because when one dies, this person is not existing anymore. So when your death exists, you do not exist. So you cannot, there is no death. That's one part of his ethics, which is very important, because then you do not have to fear death, you know, and death is not a bad part of life, because it's simply not a part of your life. It's the not life, you know. So it's not an element of your life. So it's not you. It is not relevant. It is simply not a part of your life, you know. So there's no such a thing as my death. Then talking about his tips, you know, of how to act and how to live based on his theoretical ethics, he says that all pain is fast or bearable, because you can feel pain that is very very intense, but you're gonna die soon if you feel them, so they're fast. And others are bearable, you know, others are you're perfectly capable of living with them. So, and politics, sorry, I wrote it wrong. And politics is about unnatural pleasures, all of it. And being active on politics is submitting ourselves to idealisms, to things that does not exist, to theoretical concepts that humans created, which does not is not related to their pleasures, you know, to their animal instincts and pleasures. So you do not want to seek them. The best relationship is friendship, because it gives you lots of pleasure, but different from romantic ones, it does not come with pain. Epicurus says that in general, romantic relationships in relationships you have a lot of responsibilities with your partner, and lots of and since it is very intense, it also brings lots of pain and lots of disagreement, because it is very intense. And normally friendships are soft, so they do not bring you perturbation. Remember, Epicurus wants not he wants peace. You know, he says that peace is the most important pleasure. So in general, friendships are peaceful, so that it is the most important, the best relationship. And then he talks about the tetrapharmacons, which are four things in your life that is like a medicine, you know, that you can, if you apply it to your life, you're gonna get a lot happier. Do not fear gods, because as he explained in his physics, the gods do not change anything on our lives besides the a priori knowledge. We cannot use these terms right now because they were not developed. Like there was not even Latin in that time for us to talk about a priori. But yeah, that's what Epicurus meant in other terms. And so they do not change much thing on our lives, so we do not have to fear them. Do not fear death, because it does not exist. Pleasure is accessible and pain is not significant. As we said in the first topic, pain is fast or bearable, and as we said on on the last slide and the fifth topic, the natural and necessary pleasures are the most important ones, and they are very accessible. You know, almost everyone is capable of drinking when you're thirsty, and eating when you're hungry, and resting when you're tired. And if you're not seeking for the unnatural pleasures, you're probably gonna have time to eat and have time to do whatever you want. So that's the pharmacons that he talks about for you to live happily. And Epicurus is very optimistic. Like he says that happiness is quite accessible for everyone. In general view, that's the Epicureanist ethics. He believes that pleasure is the most important thing, but also he is not that crazy and animal that the stereotype of an hedonistic makes us think, right? And that's it. Now talking about the Stoics, Stoicism. Stoicism comes from Epicureanism, but have lots of disagreements with it. But it also have some agreements. Both have the project. Both have the same project of submitting philosophy to ethics, and both agree about the branches of philosophy. So they agree that the philosophy is divided on logic, physics, and ethics, and that ethics is the most part. But in general, they disagree on everything, on all the rest, right? They disagree in all the rest, being as two sides of the same coin, right? So if Epicureanists are are atomists, the Stoics do not accept atomism. If Epicureanists say that God does not change anything in our lives, the Stoics says that God changes everything in our lives. If the Epicureanist says that, I don't know, that the universe is random, then the Stoics says that the universe is perfectly calculated. So they are quite different. And I'll divide, and the book that I'm basing our course in divides Stoicism in early, mid, and later Stoicism. Early Stoicism is the one that the biggest one, which gives the most physical and logical base for Stoicism. Mid Stoicism is not really important at all, and later Stoicism are the biggest names of ethics, right? They really develop the practical part of Stoicism, which the early Stoics didn't develop that much. They developed more the physics and logical part of Stoicism. Then talking about the logic, catapletic expressions comes from senses but are filtered by our rationality. So we have impressions that comes from senses, and these impressions become catapletic, as they say, when it is filtered by our rationality, when our rationality judge it as a valid impression. That's a quite simple element. And the rationality is in this case does not create nothing. It only judges the impression using the other impressions as a ruler. So the rationality is not really, as Plato says, putting its own, nature on the thing. The catapletic impressions are just impressions that fit with other impressions. The rationality is simply something that organizes the impressions, right? And then make a coherent system with them. And the impressions of this system are the catapletic impressions. Being radical materialists, uh, arguing that truth and judgment are bodies, they do not see values in metaphysical concepts, right? That's quite obvious. Since they are radical materialists, they believe that everything is a body, is made of matter. And I'll explain why it is possible for them to say that truth and judgment and all these things are made of bodies when I get to the physics, right? Because then we're gonna understand how can something as truth be a body. And they have a quite interesting theory for that, quite interesting proposal. And the less pragmatic, sensitive, and apparent, the further from reality. So if reality is matter, if reality and if our rationality can only comprehend the catapletic impressions, They only organize the impressions. The further you go from the impressions, from the senses, the the worst you are in being a philosopher. The further you are from reality. You're just making theoretical, sophisticated absurds, right? For all the Stoics, and that's why their philosophy is really pragmatic. They were like they strongly developed, tips for life and pragmatic ethical principles. So because they think that these are is the object of philosophy. This is the thing that we need to study. We need to study the sensitive and apparent information that we get. In this point, they're quite similar from the Epicureanist logic, but they differ here because the Epicurus is more radical, right? He believes that all senses are truth. The Stoics are moderate. They say that only catapletic impressions are valid. And now we're talking about the Stoic physics. Now we're going to the last part of our class. Now we're getting into just three very big and complex slides. So the Stoic says that existing is being capable of acting and happening, and only bodies can do that. They say that we can define existence as happening, and only bodies happen, Our thoughts, our ideas, the form is not actually something that is happening, that is acting in the world. So they say that saying that this is existence does not make a lot of sense. This definition, I don't see it as very good definition. It seems quite vague, but that's how they explain it. But they also think that matter can be divided infinitely, against atomism, that says that it can be divided until the atoms. So one body can penetrate others. And then we come back to what I was saying about the logic. They say that judgment and truth are bodies. So the the truth can penetrate the utterance that you say. If I say I have hands, then truth is penetrating my body. It's another body that is penetrating mine because the bodies can be divided infinitely. So they can infinite amount of things can penetrate my body freely because they are divided infinitely. There's no collision. There is no space that they can like fulfill. They can freely penetrate one another. And bodies have a passive element, matter, and an active form. And the form is defined by an intelligence, logos, God, right? They say that we have the matter and we have the form. The form is another body. Everything are bodies. So the form is one element, a material element that is not matter. They use the same word for that. I don't know why, but they say that they use the word matter for defining this element, the passive element of things. So if I have this liquid paper, then I have its matter, which is plastic, and it is passive because the form defines it. If you can remember Aristotelic metaphysics, it's going to be a lot easier to comprehend this idea of like form and matter building the thing, and the form being the element that defines matter. If you remember potency and act, that gets a lot easier to get. And being active, the form is defined by an intelligence because it is an action. If you look to the world, you can only see beings that act. Only alive beings act. And then the thing that is the pure act, the form, which acts beyond anything, which defines and changes everything, is infinitely powerful, right? It is God. So that's how they prove God. They prove God by the organization of the universe. It's a very common way of proving God. So they say that God is heat, That's a very strange part, but it makes sense if you think about the context that they were, right, in ancient uh, Macedonian Empire, because it penetrates everything and it is more present in the most alive bodies. If you look to a human, the interior of a human is quite hot. And if you look to a fire, the fire is extremely alive. The fire is a symbol of life, of pleasure, of intensity, and of emotion. So it is very alive. It moves a lot. The fire is always moving. So they see this relation between being alive and being hot. So God is pure heat. God is defined by the Stoics by pure heat, and this heat is what put form on the matter, right? Then talking about the second part of Stoic physics, God is a seed with all the seeds, creating all beings and all the creators. Here we comprehend. They have this concept of seed, you know? They talk about seeds a lot. And God is this seed that creates all the things that are creators, right? Then everything is good because there is no matter without form. There is no thing that does not have God, you know? And everything fills with only one fragmented conscience, the conscience of God. So everyone is the same one. Everyone is God. Everyone is perfectly good, and everyone has the same conscience. We divide the same responsibility. We divide the same consciousness, as I said. So we're all one. Where this conscience is just fragmented in other conscious, but they all gather into only one because because God is what unifies everything. Here we have a lot of influence from Parmenides, right? Of gathering everything into one principle, because in other way it would not make sense for having multiple things. So the Stoics in general are very similar to Parmenides, obviously changing lots of things, but yeah, they have this relation. Therefore, the world is absolutely perfect, and the providence is absolutely rational, the opposite of Epicureanism, because the Epicureans say that the world is completely random and our existence just happens as it is because, well, it happens infinite amount of worlds. So one of these worlds would be ours. But for the Stoics, the world is made for being perfect. The world is God. So, and God is obviously perfect and all and infinitely powerful. So everything that happens is because of a fate, and a fate that is rational, that is good, that is perfect. And freedom is not it is freedom is to act according to your will. And wisdom people brings your freedom. Oh, and wisdom brings you freedom because your will is the same as God's. So everything happens in God's will. But if your wisdom, if you are correct, your will is the same of God because God's will is perfectly rational. So if you have the right comprehension of the world, then you have the same thoughts, the same uh, conceptions, and the same will of God. So everything happens according to your will. So then you're free. Everything you want happens, and you're completely free if you are really infinitely wisdom. So that's why the Stoics defend a lot that you need to seek for wisdom, because wisdom is going to bring you freedom. And not only freedom, but also happiness, also a good life. But we're going to talk about it in the ethics part. Just now, we're going to talk about the freedom part because, freedom is a metaphysical concept, not only an ethical concept, although it is very important for ethics, obviously. But heat is always also destructive. We can see it. We can see that fire is it's very destructive. It can also be a symbol of chaos and very bad things how could it be God? They question themselves. Well, the word repeats is the only answer for that is that the world repeats itself over and over, destroying and rebuilding. And this idea is insanely important for history of philosophy. That's very curious because I think this idea, I consider this concept a very bad one, a very bad explanation of the word, but it repeats itself a lot during Christian, like literally from Christian philosophy to Friedrich Nietzsche. They all agree that the word repeats itself. This idea of repetition comes from the fact that God is absolute, it's infinite. It cannot like have a beginning and an end, right? So it keeps rebuilding and repeating, repeating and repeating to act and to make the good infinite, If world is good and it is infinitely good, it's going to repeat infinitely because for the good to be the most as it can, because God is absolutely perfect. It needs to be done again and again and again infinitely. And it always goes from pure heat to the world as we know, and then come back to heat again. So the world is all destroyed by heat, and then it is rebuilt by heat, which is God, and then going back and forth, repeating and repeating and repeating, and doing good stuff again and again and again. It solves the problem of the movement, right? Because it solves the problem that things cannot move. The Stoic says, no, for God to exist, for the world to have only one element, only one thing, which is heat, which is God, it needs to repeat because it needs to affirm himself infinitely. And then we have the movement part. The movement is the repetition of God. Humans are special manifestations of God because they're more rational than all the other things. So remember that I said that fate is rational, that the fate that God provides is perfectly rational and perfectly correct. So humans are the most rational being. So it is a special thing, the human beings. Just as fire is a very special thing because it is very alive too. So the Stoics really make this use this criteria of like more alive or less alive, or more existing and less existing. The most heat it has, the most intelligence it has, the most God it has, the most existing and the most alive the thing is. Because remember, they believe that everything is alive, right? They believe that acting, that just only being a body is acting. So, and acting is being alive. And they also say that everything is God. So clearly everything is alive in a certain level. But we're more alive. But there can be things that are more alive than others, right? And our soul is divided by in 8 parts. I don't think this is really important, so I briefly talked about it here. The most important one is the rational, because it's the expression, the biggest expression of God, on our soul. It's followed by the five senses. Then we have 6 parts: self-formation and generation of other stuff. So we have an element of our soul, which is made for our own development, and another for developing other stuff, right? To the generation of other stuff. And that's in general the Stoic physics. That's really interesting to talk about them as physics because it is very metaphysical. It talks about God. It talks about like very vague concepts, just as heat, and this complex repetition of the word, and this cosmology, almost like if it is religious. But they also say that everything is matter and everything is made of bodies. So they also think that they're doing physics, and this name we use today for that, uh, science that is criterious and that would never accept theories, just as the Stoics. So it's very interesting to see how physics developed um, during history. But okay, going back to the thing. That's it. We finished our class. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you could understand the beginning of Stoicism and the end of Epicureanism correctly. And that's it. Thank you for watching.